Okay, so Ethan's training part two. You didn't see part one. We recorded part one last week. We talked about your day one thoroughly, and we were alluding to another one of the days. I don't recall which of the days. I think it was maybe the leg day, the hamstrings day that we talked about a little bit. I don't know if that was recorded or not, but we'll go over it again, I think, because it'll be pretty quick. Um, but goals for this episode are going to be to go over the other 2 to 3 training days of your week and just kind of go through them in a similar way that we went over the day one, talking about your exercise selections, rationales, etc. So if anyone who's listening has not listened to the previous one, I think that's a useful one to listen to because there's a lot of discussion around paradigm and process and modeling, not just the individual day and what exercises that we are or that Ethan is choosing that we're talking about. So we're past day one, which was the chest stuff. I think pretty much just the chest stuff, or there might have been some middle delt stuff there as well. So you go, and that's on a Monday usually. And on a Tuesday, you come in, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about any of that. On a Tuesday, you come in, and what are we doing on Tuesdays?
Yeah, so Monday is push, chest, front delt, and then I do a couple bicep exercises at the end.
Yeah.
Then more recently, one tricep exercise as well. I don't know if I mentioned that, but it's loaded, more in a short position in terms of like the shoulder position and in terms of the loading profile to a degree. Um, on Thursday, so day three, which is the other day we talked about, we kind of stuck more to the upper body days. We talked about the pulling day, so all things on the back. And that day just finishes with one bicep exercise. Again, kind of that short bicep exercise. So I have a few body parts that I'm training twice a week and some that I train once a week and kind of comes down to just fitting everything in terms of not having one day being too long, looking at injury history, and also just overall kind of systemic fatigue based on which movements I'm doing, and where sort of these other body parts fall in the day. So if I'm doing like a really long leg day, let's say I just finished with lunges, probably not going to go train something else after doing squats, leg press, lunges, and think that that's going to be highly effective based on the amount of systemic fatigue I'm generating. Or if I'm doing a day like say the chest day that I mentioned, and I want to get 9 sets of biceps in for the week. If I just did, 12 sets to failure pushing, and I'm going to put, 3 more exercises after that, I find that I would rather do a couple bicep exercises and superset that maybe with, another tricep exercise versus 3 exercises back to back, for biceps where, okay, now we're hitting that like 2 hour mark and, the productive training may just start to diminish a little bit there. So, and the other consideration is also which gym I'm training at and what equipment I have access to. So there are some pieces where I just don't have access to at the given gym I'm training that day. And it's just a nice kind of pairing where, for example, with calves, I really like the rotary calf machine where I'm seated and it's still a knee extended or, legs like knees locked out position. And the machine has a really good profile in terms of being light when I'm completely, when I'm plantar flexed. So the spot where I'm the weakest. And because we don't have that at the other gym that we train at on the other day, I do a seated calf raise and I do lengthened partials like in a leg press calf raise. So there's some practical considerations, but some of kind of the single joint, non-systemically fatiguing exercises and areas where I don't have a previous injury history, those are things where you might see me do them, twice a week. So calves, bicep, tricep, I do it a hamstring, like a standing hamstring curl in a short position on one day, where the other 2 days are more of a hip hinge and seated hamstring curl. So you see a little bit of a twice a week paradigm, but with the bigger, more systemically fatiguing stuff, pushing, pulling, quad training, that for me right now is once a week.
So I'm 100% confident that you and I talked about your pull day, but I'm
Yeah.
about 50% confident that it was recorded.
No, we didn't talk about legs at all. We definitely talked about the pull day. And then afterwards we texted about the exercises. We didn't fit, so the pull day we just didn't finish talking about. We started talking about it and
You're
then we
so right. You're so right.
texted about it.
Let's
Yeah,
start back
we
from
gotta revisit
exercise.
it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because
We
I,
just we can put like a quick just summary cap on the other one. So, just going straight through it. Day one, push, bicep, one tricep. Day two, bunch of leg shit, quad focus. Day three, pull, one bicep exercise. Day four, hamstrings, calves, triceps, middle delts. And there's some other stuff sprinkled in between. So those 4 days training, Monday, Tuesday, off Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, off Saturday, Sunday. Um, Saturday is a day I just at this point completely it's besides taking clients in the morning, I just don't go into the gym to train at all. Wednesday, Sunday, cardio days right now. So we can get into more of the details of programming, whether it be like why the rest days are laid out the way they are, where does cardio fit in, and this, pre-contest posing fits in, sets, reps, rest period, stimulus. We've tackled some of that stuff before, but I'll try my best to stay on the exercise selection train today, because I know in the beginning of the last episode, we probably spent a good hour before we even got there. So we left off on the pull day. Quick summary on the push day. We started off with like a pec deck machine where the pads are at the elbow, and moved into a chest press machine. Both of those are Nautilus. Both of those are a little bit more of the like sternocostal or sort of horizontal to decline path. The fly being a little bit more biased in terms of getting into a shorter position, the press being more biased getting into the lengthened position, and almost doing like a 3/4 kind of rep with the press in terms of what lines up well for my biomechanics and anatomy. Um, then we move into more of a fly to press with like with a cable setup, and we're aiming more for like a clavicular front delt stimulus, and then a press, which again is in that kind of inclined position. And I'm really overloading again the lengthened position there with a partner, sort of resisting the eccentric, and with a little bit of resistance also in that beginning of the concentric, moving into two bicep exercises, one with my arm behind me, one with my arm in front of me, and then supersetting one of those with like basically a very long rope variation for triceps, something that's just like easy to recover from in a few days, but gets a massive pump when I'm supersetting that with like the preacher curl cable variation. Anything on that day that you want to tie a knot on, or any thoughts that you have as far as like redundancy or things, that might be additional considerations there.
so I think that, and I was having this conversation with someone in the like the Discord members group yesterday, actually, why the whole pec fly thing is so distinct from, or maybe not so distinct, but just distinct from something like a press, and like, you're doing both of them, and kind of the question is, maybe why are you doing both of them? So I think in general, it's good to first start with the distinction when you're comparing exercises of what are the differences in force angle and force direction, which are obviously related, but not exactly the same. So when you're comparing, let's say, a press and a fly at the same exact angle, and you're using something that is like a machine, and you are set up, what we'll say, appropriately on the machine, the force angle and the resistance direction on that machine is constantly changing. And the word that is most appropriate to use is it's loading you in something that's called a tangent, which basically a tangent, it's much easier to just do a quick Google and to visualize like when you say tangential loading, what that is. But it basically just means that it stays 90 degrees from your lever, which in this case is your upper arm. So if you are picking an exercise that is loading your upper arm in a tangent or tangentially, versus you are picking an exercise that is loading you more linearly in quotations, right? Because all forces are linear. But the point just being that with the quote linear, exercise like a straightforward press, be it a cable press or, a machine press, even that's even slightly converging, diverging, those exercises put a lot more stress and strain, we'll say, on motions that are forward and backward, right? So presses forward and backward, which intuitively should make sense to people, and then flies because the direction of the pads, if you're using a machine, are changing. The direction is obviously changing along with those pads. So I think that the pec fly option is a great option. Um, Specifically when you have those pads to go on the elbows, just because of how much more comfortable it can be for people, number one. And then number two, I think it can be a great option just for training more upper arm motion specifically, as opposed to loading the shoulder girdle repeatedly. And the distinction there being that the shoulder girdle includes clavicle and scapula and upper arm, and something like a fly would more predominantly just be loading the upper arm segment. Now, obviously, force not being the same as motion, there can be less motion at those other segments, and there still obviously has to be force going through them. So I'm not saying that there isn't force going through the shoulder girdle on the fly. But the point is just generally that, if you're doing a press and a fly at the same angle, muscles that attach directly to the shoulder girdle. So, something like the upper pec, for example, attaches to your clavicle. If something attaches to your shoulder girdle and then to your arm, which is essentially just all within the shoulder girdle, it can't move the whole shoulder girdle together, right? It has to attach to something else. So when we're talking about, a fly versus a press, we're really talking about a distinction in muscles maybe that have more advantage versus less advantage in relationship to those loading directions. So I think a good reason to include a fly, sort of getting to the point now, and this is really the only thing I wanted to say about that day, is just that you are, in some sense, sort of deloading those other qualities in terms of just shoulder girdle motion, because that's something that especially gets stressed with a lot of pulling motions. Like there's not a lot of pulling motions that are built so that they arc perfectly with your arm, like a reverse fly machine or something like that. So you are deloading some of those tissues, or when I say deloading, I really just mean creating some degree of variability and stress, which I think is in your case a good thing in this particular context. And then in addition, if you were to do it at, like, let's say an angle that was maybe slightly less decline and slightly more sort of toward the middle, you would probably have proportionally a lot more upper pec involvement as compared to even middle pec when the apparent angle looks similar. And again, the reason why is simply because not only of the direction of your arm, but just the fact that your upper arm, your humerus, is the main thing that's being loaded, given that loading direction change. So the takeaway there is that I think both presses and flies are valuable for the differences in force directions, and not just at one point in the exercise, but obviously throughout the whole range. And I think both should, at some point, whether it's in the same week or the same mesocycle, should probably be included in some way, shape, or form. I just think that, per our earlier conversations about just comfortability or comfort in something like a fly, loading them at the elbow is definitely my preference. And I have definitely found that people have trouble setting up flies, specifically in machines, when they grab them with their hands. So if you can, setting up a fly sort of loaded higher up on the arm, even if it's just on the forearm, it can make a big difference, especially at, with elbow and forearm stuff. But I do think that that distinction is important to point out. And I think everything else is pretty straightforward. So
Yeah, I
if
think
you
the
have any
main
thoughts on that.
main takeaway that I get from that is like, for a fixed number of sets, we'll call it in this case 12 sets of things for like pecs and front delts, that it's probably more sustainable to split it in terms of pressing and flying motions, from an orthopedic standpoint, and then also from like a being able to diversify the stress orthopedically and thus also muscularly. So from, an isolation standpoint and also from an orthopedic standpoint, like it theoretically would be more beneficial to do a little of each than to just do all of one. And I think that's a principle. I use the word variability. That's a principle that's just going to kind of carry on to, all other joints and muscles as well. That when we have the option to spread out a stress, and that makes sense in terms of the goal that you're going for, that is typically going to be the strategy that we go with.
Yeah. And I think that, that's something that is probably, you know, connects a lot of different dots in terms of, you know, it involves the discussion of specific muscle recruitment, like you're saying, specific joint angles that are stressed, specific joint motions that are stressed, and then specific profiles that are differentiated across exercises. So there's so many layers that go into that, but I think that's a really concise way to think about it. And I personally really over time have liked to think about stress more in the, and sort of Tom Purvis has definitely played a huge role in this transition. Is just thinking about stress more in terms of the joint as opposed to the muscle, because if you understand the joint force, then the muscle force is kind of like, the byproduct of that understanding. And just thinking about the total stress in terms of joints first, uh, which is obviously a little bit more complex, I think, because you can't really guess what you're stressing by like where in the joint you're feeling it. It's like you can kind of be like, oh, this is like feels like more it's an upper pec type thing, but then it's a whole nother step to be able to be like, okay, well, what does the upper pec do to the clavicle and to the shoulder, and what has to respond to that? Because we also have to remember that when we're talking about training one muscle, we're not just talking about training one muscle, we're talking about training that muscle in relationship to other muscles that do similar things. And then as a consequence of that, um, uh, what muscles have to, we'll say, contract or act the most to stabilize that specific motion. So anytime your upper pec contracts, that's going to create a little bit of a different sort of co-contraction situation as compared to your middle pec, as compared to your lower pec, and so on. So yeah, cool. So did you want to move just back to your pull day first?
Yeah. So day three, pulling, and then, just one bicep exercise included at the end there. Again, like the tricep exercise, in this case, I'm in like a preacher curl kind of position, but instead of the preacher curl that's like angled downwards, it's pretty much flat on top. So I'm in a position where, if someone said, show me your bicep, someone kind of raises their arm and flexes it like that. So, front double bicep kind of position. And again, that's heaviest in the short position.
And it may sound silly, but I actually completely think, and I'm I feel comfortable saying this because it used to seem silly to me, but now it doesn't seem so silly. That's like how I would work on that sort of orchestration of contraction for that particular pose, is like doing an exercise. This is one particular case where, if you see someone swinging like a cable to mimic their golf swing, that's on like, circus side of the spectrum. But this is very sort of one-to-one, like you're literally posing, the tissues that you need to get into that position in the first place. So any bodybuilders listening, I think can take something from that, which is, your poses are just a product of obviously your cueing and stuff, but ultimately contraction and where you can contract into. And so, I think that's maybe something good to point out, is just the fact that, contraction is contraction across all, scenarios. And if you can just mimic a pose in a particular training scenario, like you're describing, I think especially if you struggle with that pose, that's probably not a bad idea.
Hmm. Yeah. And, as long as you're keeping all the other concepts in mind, like in this
Yeah.
particular example, like I've chosen a profile that isn't necessarily, an ideal from an output standpoint, but because it's that second session, uh, and I've already done all the other, pulling work up to that point, just want something I can recover from relatively quickly, relatively low as far as like, just the amount of recovery time that it's going to take before I train biceps again. So as far as just looking purely at the pulling stuff now, the discussion that we had was like which muscles are going to contribute most to what we see in the front poses. So front relaxed, front double bicep, front lat spread. When we see that stuff between our upper arm and our waist, and we say, okay, those are the lats. What is that really comprised of, and how do we prioritize what we're seeing in the front poses? I mean, when you walk out on stage, the first thing you go into is a front relax pose, and the first mandatory pose is front double bicep. So you're already, being categorized. You're already, the judges are already making a lot of their assessment just based on that silhouette. I think I see guys that don't necessarily have, a tremendous amount of tissue in other areas compared to other top bodybuilders, but they just have, a really small waist, or a really good ratio of sort of that lat or shoulder width to waist ratio. And that just really accounts for a large percentage of that initial perception, which I think is very important in terms of setting the tone. So what you had sent back to me was the priority being the like more horizontal or thoracic lat fibers first, the more vertical or lower lat fibers next, and then Teres, and then possibly some other things like serratus, and I think you said coracobrachialis
Mhm.
as well. But in terms of just this pulling day, we're looking at the horizontal, vertical lat fibers, and then Teres, and everything was kind of ordered out in terms of priority from there. Um, so what we landed on was you know, you mentioned for me specifically that what I'm looking at for like a horizontal lat exercise might not be quite horizontal, that it may be slightly more oriented like in a vertical path. You can talk a little bit about like how that might change in terms of total muscle mass increasing over time, and sort of the shape of a person influencing the orientation of their fibers. Um, and then, in terms of the vertical pulling, looking at something that was, really pulling again, kind of that total shoulder girdle upwards, elevating, everything, and getting my arm as much of an overhead position as possible, where I could still control it. And then moving into more like of a Teres focus, rear delt focus, trap focus, and that was kind of the order of things. So we came up with 6 exercises, still a little bit of work in progress, but the very first exercise being a hammer strength underhand kind of pull down position, and basically with that one, if I were to have my chest right up against the pad, it would be a much more vertical path. You would also have a profile like most hammer strength machines where it's easiest at the bottom and is getting harder as you pull down. So neither of those things we were looking for, but we're able to take that machine and say, okay, there's some things that we really like here. Could I modify this to give me what Ben's looking for? So what I did is I took some pads, one of them being more of like a rounded pad where I could put myself in a position where I was no longer upright against the hammer strength chest pad, but I was now leaning back a little bit. As I lean back, that makes the path more horizontal. And also, as I move further away from those handles, the handles have to move further in space, which starts the arc and it starts the profile at what would normally be the short position for people, which would normally, be the end of the exercise, um, and be the hardest. Now that's the beginning of the exercise for me, which is the hardest, and making the profile a little bit better. So if you can picture the weight in the back of the machine, starting parallel to the floor and then, arcing upwards. As it arc upward, it's getting lighter. So that was a profile that I was looking for. In terms of other modifications, I mean, I really like the fact that it has something that's, restraining my thighs, so it's resisting an upward pulling, and then also something that's resisting that horizontal force, which would be the chest pads that I'm using. I like that it was, bilateral, so I'm not resisting a force that's trying to twist me. That was one thing we had talked a little bit about last time, as far as just things that I tend to be sensitive to from a lower back perspective. So all in all, that's, where we're at with the first exercise in terms of finding something that was targeting those horizontal lat fibers, but was in a slightly vertically oriented direction.
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned was just the potential morphological differences in people that are, maybe more hypertrophied than others. And I think, with any sort of horizontal upper lat thing, a good rule of thumb is just to find the spot where you can maximize that forward reach and that stretch position. And something that tends, and everyone can sort of do this if you just sort of put your arm, slightly in front of you, like you're contracting your lower pec, and you sort of try to reach forward without moving your trunk. You'll notice you have a little bit of like sliding motion forward of your shoulder, but like not too much. And that will sort of gradually increase as you move up in that flexion. And what normally will happen is people will, we'll say, if you just hold your arm straight out in front of you, 90 degrees from your trunk, people will have a good amount of range there. Some people will have the most range that they can get, and it won't really increase or decrease when they raise their arm up at all. But the bigger that you get and the more that you start to sort of, as you raise your arm into that 90-degree forward position, the more tissue you accumulate and the more stuff that sort of bulks up on the anterior side of the glenohumeral joint, the more stuff can kind of get in the way. And obviously all the other shit that's, underneath of that, like I mentioned, serratus, even something like external obliques, basically things that are just sitting on the ribs. They sort of are things that will push the arms out. And so you either need to change the angle so that your arm is out to the side more, or you need to just raise it up more slightly. And so, for someone bigger like yourself, you're kind of moving away from the stuff that may be getting in the way, and you're sort of moving around those constraints to actually, get that clavicle and that scapula as far forward as you can, which again, for the upper lats, given that, it is still like a slightly higher angle, it's still something that I would call protraction. In other words, like a sliding more horizontally, which is very distinct from something like an elevation, which is more of an up to down motion, like you mentioned. So my advice to anyone, relatively bigger or relatively smaller, is just to find the place where you can both maximally reach forward while keeping a sort of upright spine, but then also maximally find just like a comfortable position. Because some people, when they reach forward, in that lower angle, maybe they get a good amount of reach, but it's just not as comfortable. And some people, when they reach a little bit higher, just given structural differences, can find a little bit more comfort. And if I had to generalize that, I would say people with wider rib cages are generally comfortable a little bit higher. People that with narrow rib cages, generally speaking, it tends not to matter as much because there's not as much stuff in the way. But that's how I would sort of find that position for people, just in terms of finding that maximal, lengthened position, and thus, the position of maximal advantage of those fibers. But for bigger guys specifically, slightly higher flexion angles, I think will be more comfortable. So yeah, and then maybe the only other thing would be you could make the argument that there may be a slight difference in recruitment of other tissues the lower that you move and the higher that you move, but I think it's fairly it's a fairly non-factor. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say on that category of things. So that's your horizontal lat pick, and I really like the way that looked. I think you said that it felt pretty good. Obviously, you'll have to sort of see how that progresses to know. And I think that that's something, especially that's interesting for you, but it also happens to everyone to some degree, which is you can set up an exercise on week one and think it's the greatest thing ever. And then you get to like week 3 or 4 where you've added like 20, anywhere from 25 to like 50% load. And you realize that there are certain problems that you just were not encountering at the load that you were using initially that you now start to encounter. So speaking of the kind of iterative process of these things, I think it's important not to get too tied to the variation that you start with, and to just be willing to make those sort of small changes or pivots whenever you feel it's necessary. Because the worst thing is just to get tied to something arbitrarily and try to sort of shove a square peg into a round hole, um, after the initial bout of success that you had. Um, so cool. So you from straight from there, you move more toward the vertical pull.
The next one is the pullover.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
this is a little bit more generalized in terms of like there's not, one specific like tissue or path that we're targeting here. But much like the fly loaded at the elbow, one of the things I like about this is just differentiating either, like we mentioned before, the path being kind of linear or more arcing, or in this case, just like where we're loading it. Am I loading it at the wrist? Am I loading it more towards, the elbow or upper arm, like we mentioned before? And I've just found being able to load from different spots, being able to have like different paths of motion, like we mentioned before, all those concepts that play into that word variability, as long as they truly are variable, I think are nice. So I like getting a little bit of like pre-fatigue on, these other fibers that are doing the pulling motion before moving into everything else, so that I'm not having to, hold as much weight, not bearing, as much stress potentially like on the elbow. So I like to move into that next for that reason. So with the pullover, the restraints that I set up are a seatbelt coming from underneath to resist, being pulled upwards, and a seatbelt at the chest to be able to get into the bottom position, which is now more of like an arcing towards me position. So just kind of lining up the restraints with the direction that I'm being pulled, or the direction that I'm trying to push into. So if I'm trying to push down, a seatbelt that I can push up into. If I'm trying to pull towards me, a seatbelt that I can push forward into. I've also found for me, again, that rounded pad comes in handy here. Put it, right behind my upper back. This seems to give me a little advantage towards the bottom of the motion, potentially just being further forward on the machine, and then also having kind of like a little bit of a downward slope to push into where it's getting really difficult. So with that one, I found over time that it was just really difficult to achieve the appearance of like a quote full range of motion, where my arms, are going, you know, overhead in the way that you might picture that arc of the machine going, or when someone hops into the machine, what they try to replicate. Just that, the pads that go on the upper arm are pretty wide. So when my arms start to go overhead, I can really no longer align my upper arm with those pads so well, because my arms, as I go overhead, want to become more narrow versus staying out wide. So in terms of like the spot that I can shove into on the pad as I start to get into an overhead position becomes, less and less advantageous and kind of more awkward from a loading position. So I played around with like throwing handles on the machine in the past, and got up to pretty heavy loads. Like there's some machines where it's just like, oh, I get to the point where I'm now like putting a gym pin in it and really putting a lot of weight in. And then maybe I find later, like for example, with the Nautilus chest press we mentioned on day one, that was one where I could put a couple extra 45s on there, if it was first in the workout. But when I'm doing the fly first, it's another good way for me to reduce load. And I found with this one similarly, if I'm not just making it, kind of this full body exercise where I'm trying to move through, like a greater, the appearance of like a greater range, with the machine, and just sort of stuck to the position where I could really like apply pressure on the same spot on the pad the whole time, and my arms weren't sort of being shoved outwards as I went up. That, in general, my shoulders felt better, and I felt like I could keep more of a like constant tension, on what feels like, my lats the whole time. So that's kind of where I've settled in, is I'm more in that, like, you know, I look at some of these exercises as like, I'm going to stay in this 3/4 of the range, where it's like, on the fly, I'm getting to a relatively lengthened position, but the 3/4 is more like mid to long, to short, and never really getting to that, full lengthened position. Same thing here. I look at this as kind of that more like, mid to short kind of exercise, where I can still, sort of stay locked in, have low stress, on the shoulder girdle, and utilize those restraints I mentioned, and then also, a training partner to help me get, a little more shove in the bottom position. So again, assisting that profile so we can make it a little bit lighter on the final reps, where I'm fully contracted.
Yeah, and one of the things that I wanted to mention was this topic of the pullover and loading directions. In the pullover, I think it's really good that you've transitioned sort of naturally toward using the mid to, the bottom portion or the mid to short position of the muscles, which, by the way, just in terms of the comparison, it's like this is an exercise for you that we could argue is maybe pretty upper lat dominant, but it probably feels like a lot of everything, sort of just a whole back blast sort of a thing. That's a pattern that, because it arcs, will sort of change its or require different things at different portions in the range. So if you were doing one thing and you were short on time, it wouldn't be a bad option necessarily. But what I wanted to mention in terms of loading direction was, when you get into that fully overhead position, whoever you are, you raise your arm overhead and you find yourself, well, the first thing I'll say is, being in an overhead position is a very structurally unstable position, which is pretty much true for, most positions in the shoulder, just because of the structure of the shoulder, meaning that unlike the hip, or unlike, the knee when it's locked and you're standing, there's not a lot of surface area of bone that is contacting bone. And so what that necessitates is, it necessitates an increased involvement of soft tissue and contractile tissue to basically hold the joint together. And when you go into that overhead position, especially, you put yourself in what I'll call a particularly unstable joint position, which doesn't mean it's bad, but it does mean that you have to be a little bit more careful, I think, in terms of like which loading directions that you choose. And something that is, I think, a very popular option, which I totally hate, is the dumbbell pullover. And it's because the dumbbell pullover is an exercise that is maximally loaded in a specific direction that is not the best for the shoulder to handle in that maximally unstable position, which again doesn't make it inherently bad or dangerous, but it does mean that you have to be a lot more careful, at least in my opinion, with those types of exercise. And specifically, when we're talking about an overhead position, the muscles that I'll say are the most advantaged in the overhead position, um, will resist force in the most direct way, just purely vertically, right? So imagine you're hanging from a bar. Imagine you're a monkey that is hanging from a tree, right? That's essentially how these tissues, that handle the vertical motion, have developed, and not to appeal to, evolution or nature, right? But that's why we had developed lats, that especially in that overhead position. That's why we had developed this fan-shaped nature, so that we can, when our arms are overhead or when our arms are in front of us, we can deal with something that's pulling us forward. We can also really deal with something that's like, we're swinging from a tree, or we're hanging from a pull-up bar. So in essence, I think it's a good idea, if your arm is overhead, to load it in the direction that your arm is already facing, and not directly behind your head. And this is to the same conversation as we were having earlier in relationship to the tangential arcing loading versus the linear loading, which is, if you're going to, load something in an arc, you are going to probably be biasing tissues that are, um, like the rear delt, like the teres major, like the upper pec, like the front delt, are crossing the actual shoulder joint itself and not attaching on the humerus into something else. So what that means in summary and maybe in clearer terms is that if you're in that overhead position, your upper or sorry, your vertical lats are going to be the things to, I think, best hold you together in that position. And so you want to essentially load them in the direction that those fibers are facing, which again would be something like hanging from a pull-up bar, or something like you're sitting in a lat pull down and your arms are stretched overhead, and not something where your arm is being pulled behind your body, where a lot of other stuff, like we'll say the costal pecs, have some degree of advantage to actually pull your arm forward. But again, they're not in the best of positions to do so. So I just wanted to make that caveat, which is that I think it's good that you're going with that variation, and that if you are doing a vertical variation and you do want to stretch and load those tissues, you need to be cognizant of force direction in that position, because again, not only just from a joint compromising perspective, it's just not a great way to load anything. From a muscular standpoint, right? It would kind of be like if you were to load your pecs, in a position where in like a reverse Y raise, where all of them are sort of sitting now on almost the backside of the humerus, as opposed to something like a press where they're kind of sitting more, on the front side where they can effectively, pull the arm forward. So cool. So you finish the pullover, and what do you hop to after that?
Yeah, now we have that more vertical pull down where my arms are going overhead, my shoulders are moving towards my ear, and I'm more so in the three quarters that is long to mid. And as I pull down, the handles are coming apart. So at the top, my hands are close together, palms are mostly facing each other, facing a little bit towards me as well. And again, just to modify the profile here, uh, as my arms are moving upwards, so I'm going through an eccentric contraction or lengthening. My wife's pushing down on the plates, so she's got this long lever in the back, which gives her kind of a mechanical advantage over me. So it doesn't require a ton of pressure for her to push down, which then makes it more difficult for me to resist being pulled upwards. So we have this kind of overloaded eccentric position and then a little bit of additional overload in the lengthen, and make sure that I'm not going for the sensation of being stretched. So I'm not just hanging out in the top and letting her push me into like a passive position. I'm controlling it the whole way. So I'm thinking of that as a contraction the whole time. I get to the position where my shoulders are near my ears comfortably, and I can still stop and control that motion versus just being pulled there and resting, and change direction and pull the other way.
Yeah, cool. And that's just kind of, the vertical variation of what we already talked about with the sliding forward and backward of the shoulder girdle, just kind of sliding upward and downward, which obviously great for loading the vertical lat stuff, and then secondarily maybe some Teres stuff as well. So yeah, no commentary on that one.
And the next one is more of a Teres focus pull down. So the arm path looks somewhat similar to a pull down where your hands would be facing away from you, or even a pull down with you know a grip where your palms are facing each other as well. But the difference is, your arms are moving in the same path, whether it be like the cable pull down or this machine that I'm using. But in the case of this machine, the arms of the machine are actually arcing. So although, if you couldn't see the machine, probably my hand path would look somewhat similar, even though you would see kind of my hands start to move together a little bit at the top and then arc downwards. So almost picture like again, an arcing motion, whether it be like a, fly, reverse fly. But I'm doing a pull down, and primarily, we're looking for Teres here. And not the only modification here is, again, it has the thigh pads, which are resisting me being pulled upwards. And then again, I take a long pad either that rounded pad I was describing earlier, or a lot of these old gyms have pads laying around that are basically akin to like half of a bench that you would lie on. So it's just like wood in the back and some type of like soft material in the front. So I'll just kind of wedge that into like my hip crease, and it allows me to actually sort of shove into it. There's certain machines where you can wedge a pad and it still allows me to kind of press my chest into it when I'm in the bottom position. So that's really the only change that I make there is now I have, a pad that's resisting me from being pulled forward and pads on my thighs that are resisting me from being pulled upwards. It's an arcing motion, similar to what you'd have with another pull down, but more directly loading that arc versus just a vertical resistance.
Yeah, and the Teres is a little, this is not a perfect analogy, but I like to kind of equate the Teres more similar to the vertical lats and the rear delts more similar to the horizontal lats, where the Teres will kind of be the guy that's more involved with like the vertical arcing type motions. And the rear delt is kind of going to be the guy that's more involved with the horizontal arcing type motions, to our conversation earlier, just about loading those those single joint guys that just cross the shoulder to the shoulder rather than the shoulder to something else. So that's, I think, a cool comparison across the front side and the back side of the body there. Yeah, and another thing also with that specifically is just if your arms are moving away from your body, um, it's likely that you are moving away from lat territory. So if you were to do a pull down that's kind of like a wide pull down, you would have a lot more lat involvement toward this bottom half where your humerus is kind of coming into you as compared to that top half where your arm is going away from you, just because of the fact that your lats they are coming off of your rib cage, right? So anything that is moving your arm away from your rib cage, generally speaking, is I'll say less lat involved than something that is, you moving your arm toward your ribs or tighter to your ribs. Um, so yeah, okay, cool. So horizontal lat um, stuff, pullover stuff, vertical lat stuff, Teres. So that's I think 4 so far. And then what do we happen to
Now, the same
next?
kind of thing, like you mentioned, moving horizontally now in that arcing path for rear delts. So,
Yep.
a supported row that's, moving in an arcing path. And in this instance, I have the assistants helping me in the short position. So, my wife is pushing on the levers themselves. And again, she's got pretty good leverage to help, like, as I move my arms behind me. So kind of like what we call a rear delt row here.
Mhm. Cool. Yeah. And obviously, depending on the machine, will be, some decent upper lat stuff too. But it's crazy the amount of difference that just a slight change in the loading direction can make on the forces. And this is a good example of something that just looks like it's a linear row. But if you just sort of break down the different force angles at the different points in the range, it does make a huge difference just having that slight sort of change in load direction throughout the range.
And then the last exercise is more of a low to high row. So there are a lot of row, as I walk around the gym that I'm training at on this particular day, there's probably 30 machines that train the back, if I had to guess. And a lot of them are positioned where the handles of the machine or the levers of the machine are coming from uh, beneath you, or the machine is sort of angled forward so that you're leaning into the chest pad. And that might give you the appearance that you're rowing from low to high. But much like we talked about with the cable setup, you could set up an incline bench, in front of cables and be doing more of a horizontal or even like decline press, depending on where those cables were coming from. So in this case, there was really only one machine in the gym that actually had a path that arced, low to high. Whereas there was a lot of machines where the handles were coming from down low, but based on the position, of the chest pad and how the levers in the machine were moving, it was really just the same horizontal row from different positions. So I chose to use the hammer strength again, um, low to high row. And I also wanted something where it wasn't like entirely, wasn't as much motion, at the elbow as some of the other rows where I was just doing like the same thing that I'd done on the other exercise before that, the, chest supported row for the rear delt. Um, ultimately like allowing for some elbow movement to happen. But if I could then, the goal of this exercise being to prioritize more of like the traps. If I could find something where I could load the traps, but not, be redundant with just another like heavy rowing exercise. That's what I was going for here. So that, like I said, that was the only one that had the path that I was looking for. And then the next thing, I had to set up was something that like was more directly in line with how my arms were going to move. So you described earlier just like the shape of the rib cage, the amount of tissue influencing where your arms are sitting passively, and thus sort of the direction that you would load them in. So, loading something, if your arms, if you have that like, lat syndrome look where your arms are sort of pointed out like a triangle, they're hanging out at your sides, having something that loaded you straight down to the floor would pull your arms inward against all that tissue. So I wanted something ideally that I could set up a little bit wider, um, where it wasn't just, pulling me straight forward into all that tissue. So kind of a work in progress right now is this, low to high trap row that I'm doing.
Yeah, I like that you coined lat syndrome. It's not imaginary lat syndrome. It's just lat syndrome. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think for that one too, just to kind of experiment with the amount of humeral motion, because I think that if you have even if you have a good amount of it, just because of the load direction, it will be so it will I think it will feel so trap dominant regardless, even if there is, a moment for upper, humeral extension there. Um, so just kind of continuing, and that's one of those things that could change drastically with the loading, like we mentioned earlier. So that's your last exercise for the pull day, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool, cool. So yeah, I like how we kind of covered the full spectrum there. So I want to talk about I don't think leg, who knows with us, but I don't think your leg days will take as long to talk about. Not that we have to rush through them, but just generally speaking, there are a lot fewer options and a lot more of those options people will probably be familiar with naturally. So let's go through your day one, your quad day.
Yeah. So quads end up actually being like the last thing that I train on this day because they're the most systemically fatiguing. So, like I mentioned at the beginning, anything that was coming off of doing the, squat, leg press, lunge, isn't going to be particularly effective. But a lot of stuff that would precede it is also, not really going to affect the quad training. So it's easier for me to put that stuff first. It kind of serves as like, an orthopedically friendly way to go about it as well. So potentially reduces some load, and then just prioritizing the order as far as like, what I am okay with limiting what thereafter. So I start with that rotary calf exercise that I mentioned. Calves have been a priority for me for a long time. And that doesn't really seem to have much of an effect on anything thereafter. So we start with that. I then move into the abduction and adduction machines, and then from there into a standing hamstring curl, which precedes a leg extension. Just in general, found doing some hamstring curls before leg extension. In this case, hamstring curl in more of a short position in terms of again the leg itself and then the profile as well. So there's a kind of that consistent theme of I'm training something on a second day, but it may also be in a shorter position, both in terms of the what's happening at the joint and the profile. So then it's a leg extension, and then I move into basically like a hack squat that is loaded like basically the pad is at my hip versus, being loaded axially down from my shoulders. And then and that's done kind of more of like sissy squat style, where it's very much focused on uh, the knee bending versus, what I'm getting at the hip, which ultimately is going to, come naturally, but it's not like the goal that I'm going for. Versus the leg press that I'm doing, putting my legs in a position where I can maximize hip flexion as well, and then finishing off with lunges. So that's day 2.
Well, that's fucked up. So you go from hack squat to leg press to lunge.
Leg extension, hack squat, leg press, lunge. Yeah.
And what brand of leg press is it? Do you know?
Yeah, it is. So I know the line is called Raptor.
Oh, great. Yeah, just something no one's ever heard of. Great.
Yeah, I don't even know what the brand is, but I know the line. So it can be, there's like a metal pole that goes in where it can be done bilateral, or you can pull out the pole and you do it unilateral.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
I do it bilateral again from that standpoint of not wanting to deal with a lot of force, twisting me. And the one of the interesting things about this leg press is the foot plates are actually positioned in, I guess you would call like for
This
describing. What's that?
like they supinate you?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, so they will invert your ankle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if like to put it in like normal people terms, I guess it would be like they are moving away. Like the middle is, moving away. They're moving away from each other. Right. Like what's a term like we could describe it to someone who maybe didn't understand
Yeah,
supination?
yeah. I feel like a good way to it's like a very mild version of like if you are sitting in a chair and your feet are both flat on the ground, if you just gently pick up the insides of your feet so that your legs move outward, that's kind of what the foot plate is doing to the feet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, potentially affecting the rest of the whole, hip complex as well.
Yeah.
So
Which may not actually, depending on how much your tibia moves, may not actually change the relative foot position very much, but I'm assuming that it does. Yeah. Because your tibias still have to be, forward enough to push into the to push into the plate. Yeah, they can't be sideways. So
yeah, it's a very slight angle. Um, so yeah, that's the overview there. We described the calves already. One thing that was interesting was, I use handles, uh, you know, on the calf, the rotary calf already has handles, to resist this. You have obviously a back pad behind you, which is resisting you like a leg press, from being just, pushed backwards. But then there's also handles to resist, being shoved upwards. Um, I can't reach the handles just because of the amount of like, ass girth and lat. So I bring my own handles, I attach them to those handles. That allows me to, reach these, new handles that I've created. So I didn't have those for like the first, 10 minutes I was training the other day. And it was really interesting to see the difference in output. So, I had like the stack on there. I do my first set, and I'm being shoved, up the pad, like my butt's, being pushed off the seat, and there's like two machines on either side of me that I'm like, holding on to essentially. Um, and it also sort of changes where I'm at in the arc, of that rotary calf machine. So I wasn't able to, fully get into like a plantar flex or short position. And I think I got like, say 12 reps or something. And then like few minutes later, when I got the handles, even though I had the fatigue from getting like the 12 reps the first time. So in a normal, uh, in a normal session, let's say I did 12 reps to failure, the next set's probably going to be like 9 reps just because of that fatigue. But when I added the handles, I then got like, 14 reps on the next set, even with the previous fatigue. So just a really good example of this is not even an exercise where those handles would be like, completely instrumental to output, but just adding adding the handles, made a significant difference.
Yeah. I actually was watching a Sam Sulek video yesterday, um, who I think we've probably met, most people listening probably know him, and we've mentioned him before. And I also, before I say anything about him, I just always want to make it clear that I think overall his training is like net positive. He just does the basic stuff. He trains hard. He's a little bit of like an ego lifter type guy who likes to toss stuff around, which I wouldn't advise everyone do. But overall, I don't think his training is terrible. Um, and I think that he's sets a good example in most of the important ways for people in terms of just making progress in the gym. So just to contextualize that, nothing personal here. But he was doing like a chest drop set sort of a thing. Uh, and the way that he described it was, so he was standing in the middle of like a super wide cable stack. So, walk over, grab one cable, and he was doing it like straightforward first. And then what he was saying was that he was going to then change the angle to be more of like a costal thing. So more of like a middle upper pec thing to more of a middle lower pec thing, just to, get the full pump. But what he ended up doing was he ended up going to failure with the horizontal one and then just orienting his whole body downward. So it was the exact same loading angle, just with more stability. And I think that's another interesting example of what you're describing, where he went to failure without any, ability to shove into anything. And then he had a little bit of his body weight, and all of a sudden it was like 10 more reps at the exact same angle. So it was like accidental drop set via increased stability. Which I think is a funny concept. I don't believe the concept's been discussed before, so we're hearing it here first. Is my point. Okay, cool. I mean, that's all pretty straightforward. Um, I think in terms of discussing any of that stuff more specifically, it would be weird to do that without like specific visuals of the machines, because certain leg presses can be very different, and certain hack squats can look very different. The point I just wanted to bring up, when you say loading at the hip on the hack squat, you mean like behind your lumbar spine, right?
Yeah, yeah. The
Like,
pad, the pad goes up to, well, I mean, the pad actually goes up to my shoulders, but because it's angled forward, the actual like pressure on the pad is mainly through
uh,
hips and lower back. So
okay.
pressing into that. I mean,
Okay, cool.
just to touch on the stuff, after calves for a second, like the abduction, adduction machine. That's when I end up using the gym pin on. And because again, it's difficult, where I'm the weakest, what I do is I'll do 2 sets full range, and then I'll do 1 set in just like a lengthened partial position. Um, then in terms of like the standing leg curl, I've just found, doing a lying leg curl for me, which would also be, in the short position via movement of the upper leg, that I'm not able to set that up in a way that um, allows me to get a lot of knee flexion, or allows me to find a path that doesn't over time cause some stress to the knees. Um, and I find with the standing one, at least, for the 6 months or so that I've been using it up to this point, it is so hard in that top position or short position. And I'm really just focusing my reps there. And it is so light in terms of like the bottom position relative to that, that I am again kind of picking an exercise that's really just biasing a specific range that loads again with that concept of sort of being like um, you know tangential, in a way where I'm not like shifting the loading direction as I move through the exercise, and it tends to feel healthier on my knees. Um,
Mhm.
Kind of like hoping for you to maybe step in and give a little bit more clarity to what I'm trying to say there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think it's twofold. I think one is is obviously just the amount of absolute load, right? So when your knee is straighter and you're doing the leg curl, generally speaking, much like with that overhead example that I was trying to describe with the pullover thing, you just don't have a lot of muscles that have a super high advantage in that position. And I think that's just a byproduct of the fact that there is a lot of structural stability if you're standing in that position, right? So you don't need a lot of muscular involvement, just like, again, not to do the appeal to nature thing, but I think it's relevant. So anyway, in that fully knee straightened position, much like in the fully elbow straightened position, you are maybe more vulnerable in with those loading directions or with that overhead thing that I was describing to a little bit of what we'll just call it, higher degrees of joint stress. And I think that a big player in that in relationship to like something like a lying hamstring curl would be just how much that position is loaded. So, in the lying variation, a lot of times there is depending on the angle of the pad and everything, your knees are still heavily loaded. And in something like a standing, it tends to be not the case. And even if it is the case, it's kind of like because you're in a standing position, and I'm assuming, do you have like one knee up, like supported on
No,
the other side, or is it
I'm
like,
no, I'm fully standing, and there's just a pad that I'm shoving my chest and you know, hip into.
yeah, yeah, right. So you literally don't even have the ability for gravity to sort of be tipping your body in the direction of the pad. So when you get to the bottom, number one, if the resistance profile is lighter, there's a lot less loading and a lot less stress. And then number two, just because of the constraint of where you are relative to gravity, there's nothing that's continuing to try to extend your knee from that more neutral position. So there's basically just there's a lot less of an intent for your knee to be pushed past where it can naturally sort of go to. The thing that you were describing though about how the direction changes and how the pad may just stay in a tangent. Um, on some leg curls, what you will notice is the pad or it usually depends on what kind of shape the pad is. So for example, if the pad is shaped like a cylinder, a lot of times they can sort of roll up and down your leg, which can actually be useful in terms of changing the profile. But the problem with it rolling upward or downward is it may not sort of roll in a fluid way where it just kind of skates up in a sort of like parallel to your shin sort of a direction. It may not skate up smoothly. It may actually be shoving your tibia forward in a particular direction as it's rolling. So then you're starting to sort of deal maybe instead of just with like something that would want to rotate your leg, you're dealing with something that would want to rotate your leg and then also shift it sort of forward or backward in the actual socket itself, referring to the knee, of course. And so when you do have that sliding, that can be something that happens. And then when you do have a pad that is more flat to the back of the tibia, what you'll tend to notice is just an awkwardness because usually those don't roll, they just sort of create a friction, which to be honest, in some cases can be worse because it's a little bit of a stronger force rather than something rolling. It can create this like translation type thing, this sliding type thing at the knee rather than just the rotational thing. And that's difficult to notice when you're on a lying leg curl facing toward the floor because your femur is constrained, right? So it doesn't really look like there's a lot of apparent motion. But in the case of the standing leg curl, there you don't have all of that gravity and all of the weight of your leg shoving you into the pad. So in that bottom position where you are less loaded, to me, there's a tendency both to, again, just from a resistance profile standpoint, have lower amounts of force there, but then also from the standpoint of if there is rolling or sliding or friction, there's a lot lower of a consequence because you don't have all that extra weight basically holding your femur in place. Your femur may be able to actually pivot a little bit along with your leg. So yeah, so that's super interesting. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, and then two, at the top of the leg curl, I have the weight, of my lower leg as well, making the profile technically worse. But if we were just trying to bias that top position,
Yeah.
uh, being more advantageous. Um, so it's not, something that I like regularly do with other people. I've just found that, for this particular day and what we're trying to achieve, it seemed to make sense. The pad also moves. So I move the pad relatively high. It's basically like on my calf, and then I'm just going for like the top 3/4 of the motion there. And I find that like if you were to look at, say, my foot when I'm doing that, it's pointed in a direction that you wouldn't necessarily expect. It's kind of like an inward pointed direction, and you might look at that and go, "Oh, that's not like lining up with the pad really well." But based on like being able to shift that pad position and how much I have the option to kind of like orient my body here versus what I do on a lying leg curl, I can really just find a groove, so to speak, that it just feels great in terms of like moving in a fairly linear direction, where the knee doesn't ever have that sort of like twisting torque to it, or feel like I'm in a less mechanically leveraged position for the hamstrings.
Yeah, and I also think with knee stuff too, that because there is that small amount of rotation that will occur, especially, depending on who you are and not just the structure of your bones, but the way that the amount of tissue can affect that rotation. Knee stuff can look a little bit deceptive from the perspective of like loading them where they're meant to be moved. Because of that rotation, and with bigger people too, it just things in general tend to look more deceptive because you can't really see a lot of times what's going on with bone as much as you can with people who are not as big. Um, and also to the point around, what we were discussing earlier with ribcage structure and all that stuff too, that kind of a similar theme in terms of the deception. Um, okay, cool. So anything else there, or you want to just finish up with the hamstrings, calves, middle delt,
Yeah.
tricep day?
Yeah, like I said, leg extension, hack squat, leg press, lunges, leg extension. I, implement the handles again because I can't reach. I got seatbelt pulling me mostly downwards to be able to shove up into and assist with that short position, or the end of the leg extension. Uh, Gym pin both sides of the leg extension. Just gym pinning one side, I found tends to like, twist the stack a little bit. Probably won't have as much longevity on the machine. So yeah, I mean, that makes a huge, huge difference as far as like output on the leg extension. I mean, on that one in particular, the machine goes up to 255, and I'll do something like 400 on there for, a set of 15 to 20. So, gym pins on both sides, 45s and 25s on both sides. And because I really don't want to break that machine, I've tried to just use less and less weight and find ways either with like a really slow eccentric or pauses to just in even going upwards, it's, 25 reps, just find ways where I can, not have to load the machine crazy heavy and just give it a little bit more longevity. Um, like I said, hack squat. We discussed how it was loaded. So I'm, in general, just minimizing, axial loading for me, whether it be from a spine perspective based on my previous injury history. Again, not saying that axial loading is bad. It's just, simply for my previous injury history, it's something that, I try to not get in excess. And also when I do that hack squat, I do BFR.
Hmm. Okay.
So the BFR cuffs, my feet are super low on the platform. It's mostly just, I do get to the point where because the back pad is oriented forward, like that is something that's starting me in a little bit more hip flexion. So ultimately the thing that's going to limit me is at the hips. So that's why I put my feet super low and just getting as much motion through the knees. So more of like a lengthened quad bias, but then using the BFR to just minimize the amount of load that I need to use and using higher reps. Moving on, to the leg press, like I said, this is, a different hip position, different foot position. I look at it as just, almost like the pullover motion where it's just like getting a little bit of everything. I almost look at like, I have 4 exercises that I do for pressing with upper body, and I know I'm getting some, different portions of the chest and front delts. Here, it's like I'm getting, quads, adductors, glutes, and, I pick 12 exercises and just kind of spread out the stress amongst them. So depending on how I do the lunges, that can also influence, whether it's a little bit more glute bias, a little bit more quad bias. And truthfully, with that one, like I've done split squat variations in the past. I think those are can be tremendous. And you can be even more direct, and you can potentially get less systemic fatigue. So I think there's a lot of reasons why I would, in many cases, choose a split squat over a lunge. In this case, I put it last again, so can minimize the amount of load that I need to hold in my hands because I can't really get a barbell on my back. And I actually, I mean, this is one of those ones, there are reasons, like I mentioned before, where I can kind of like, it allows me a lot of freedom uh, to sort of bias what I want to bias and to be able to make adjustments with each step. So I really like that. I found, there are some exercises where like you can make arguments for other exercises sort of being more optimal. But if you have the wherewithal to be able to make adjustments within a rep, uh, certain exercises really offer that opportunity. And I feel like with each step of the lunge, I really have some options in terms of how far do I want to step, how do I want to orient my body, and from there, like how do I want to direct force? Like, am I gonna you know, immediately go into the next step? Am I going to push myself forward and then go vertically? And I think, having those options for me as someone who can, really sense what's happening internally is nice because I can sort of like work around and bias, what I want to bias. And then, ultimately, I also just like at the end of the leg day right now with, contest prep, uh, having something where I'm actually like breathing kind of heavy, sweating a little bit, and just leave with like that, euphoric feeling afterwards.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that pretty much like puts a cap on leg day number one, quad bias, but we also have all the other stuff in there. We have the calves, we have the hamstrings, adductors, abductors. So Friday being hamstrings to start, and I start with what most people would call like a 45-degree hyperextension. In this case, using the Atlantis one, we can actually set it a little bit higher than 45 degrees. And instead of going for motion at the spine, we're going more for motion at the hips, and going with like a hamstring bias here. Essentially, the movement for me at the hips is very similar to an RDL, just slightly tipped forward, which tends to make it a little bit harder, at the or significantly harder at the top relative to if you were just standing upright. Obviously, there's really no load there in terms of what the hamstrings have to work against. And I think we've mentioned on a previous episode, I use a weighted vest for that. And I load it primarily in the back. And like you mentioned, sort of having a heavy backpack on that's pulling me backwards. So that takes care of that profile component in terms of like not being too hard at the top and still having, kind of a lengthened bias focus. And I find, even considerably more than what you would get in an RDL, I'm able to finish the last few reps extremely slow and really grind out to what the sort of representation of failure that we're looking for looks like, in our other exercises with good profiles. So that's my hip hinging, long hamstring exercise number one there.
Yeah, pretty much no comments on that. I mean, I think that unfortunately not many people have access to that Atlantis piece, and it is by far the best one that I've used. I do wish that the pad on the backside was, anchored a little bit higher up toward the knee. I don't know why any of them were really built so that they were as close to the angle as possible. They should all basically be right up against the backside of the knee there. I think that would, or just below it. I think that would make it a lot more comfortable for most people. But when I don't have access to that, I think we discussed this. I use just a normal 45-degree extension, which is angled closer to the floor, and then I just put something under the front of it, so sort of moves upward in space. Okay, cool. Yeah. And so then you hop towards seated leg curl.
Yep, seated leg curl again, seatbelt assisting me with the bottom portion of the motion, whereas the seatbelt on the leg extension was, more biased towards like a vertical direction to help me at the top. In terms of helping with the bottom part of this arc, it's more of like a forward to back motion with a little bit of vertical. So I set the seatbelt up on the seated hamstring curl coming from down and behind me. So I can shove forward into it and finish that short position in the hamstring curl. Again, gym pin both sides of that, and then ideally a training partner who's helping with the bottom part of that to even further accentuate that drop off with the profile in the short position. So that's my 6 sets for hamstrings there, with 3 on the other day. In general, it's about 9 sets right now per body part, with obviously carryover from other things. It's not like there's zero hamstring stimulus in terms of some of the like pressing movements that I'm doing, but nothing that I'm really counting more than just stuff you'd get like when it comes to front delts and pressing. Like, to me, that's a little bit more one-to-one versus like hamstrings and squats, like presses, etc. So I almost everything has some carryover. Like the calves, I do 9 sets, but yeah, there's still some calves when we do the leg curling motions as well. But in general, about 9 sets per body part, about 90 sets across the week. So that's the hamstrings. Calves, again, move into the seated calf raise, which is done on the Kaiser machine, which is a really cool machine. Again, it kind of has that rotary component where it's moving through an arc. And what we do is we set it up at the bottom part of the arc, much like leaning forward in the fly that I had described on our first podcast. Being lower on this machine's arc makes it even lighter in the bottom position. So it again kind of assists that profile that we're looking for. And just because I'm the masochist with that one, I've had various protocols, over the last couple of years where I'll utilize the function of the Kaiser where I can drop the weight while I'm doing the set. Previously I may have described on the podcast, I was doing sort of a almost like an isokinetic kind of setup where the speed's relatively constant, but I'm just giving myself maximum resistance on the eccentric by just holding down the plus button and resisting being pushed up, and then pressing the minus button and just allowing that to drop off in the short. So I did that for a phase, and right now what I'm doing is I'll put 450 on, and I'll do as many reps as I can, and then I stay in the machine. I drop to 350, do as many reps as I can, 250, as many reps as I can, and then just if I get to 450 for 25 reps or 30 reps, which would probably never happen over this contest prep because I think I'm at 15 now. Then I've increased the weight, but just an easy standardized way to get a lot of reps in a short time. And it's definitely a drop set, but it's also like a continuous set. I don't need to stop at any point, so it's pretty efficient from that standpoint. And then I get in the Kaiser leg press, and I do a calf raise there. Again, I'm using some handles to be able to pull myself to resist being shoved upwards by the machine. And I elevate myself with some pads underneath my butt just to align a little bit better in terms of like how my ankle wants to move with this direction on the Kaiser leg press that's not entirely just like a straight back and forth motion, at least at the foot pad. And that one, because that machine is not intended to be a calf raise, is not set up as well as like the rotary calf that I described earlier. Again, I utilize this concept of let's take the the pros of the machine. Let's take the advantages that this thing has, use them to their fullest, and maybe to stick in the range that it kind of favors. So I just do, the length and partials with this. I never even try to get into the short position because I'm like, look, I got that covered, elsewhere. So, one of the advantages of this machine is I can put, upwards of 1,500 pounds on it. It's right now I'm using 1,000, and I'll get, 20 or so length and partials. But if you had another leg press that was plate loaded, for example, putting 1,000 pounds on, is going to be, much more systemic fatigue just carrying on the 45. So the advantage that I have with the Kaisers is really easy loading. Even if you had a selectorized leg press, usually you're not going to see it go up to 1,500 pounds. So I think that's, using the machine to, what it's favorable for. I think that's, one of the cool things that I get out of this particular scenario. Basically, like, just to be time efficient, what I try to do, and it just depends on how busy the gym is too, but like I'll superset anything that I can. Like, I can't really superset with the hip extension because I got the, 60-pound weighted vest on. So I'm sure like you could make a case for maybe do triceps with that on because you can lean forward, which gives you a little bit more, like you mentioned, of that like Sam Sulek, um, sort of restraint of your body weight. But all in all, walking around with that thing's, not the greatest. So I just do straight sets there. Seated hamstring curl, there's a lot of setup involved with that. Many times that ends up being straight sets. But if I can set something else up in the meantime, sometimes it's just simply like start doing the warm-up sets for the next thing, or find the, a piece of equipment that you need for the next thing. So oftentimes when I'm doing calves, I'm either starting to set up for triceps or warm up for triceps. And the triceps exercise I have are just like the bi one where my arm is closer to by my side. And
Repeat that last sentence just because you cut out for a sec.
okay, yeah. So the triceps, much like the biceps, I'll have one exercise where my arm is moving towards an overhead uh, kind of position, and one where my arm's more at my side. So right now, I'm starting with the one where my arm is a little bit more in an overhead position. For me, that overhead position, again, doesn't look necessarily like it would look for another person in terms of how much motion I have. And also just with limitations that I've had from previous shoulder surgeries, just playing sports, I don't have a tremendous amount of external rotation. So that also limits, where the cable can be coming from. So for me, the overhead position looks very much like what most people would call more of like an abducted, position. So it's, it's arms, arms basically parallel to the floor rather than it being like arms, by my ear. Um, and then, because I came into this block with the elbows being a little bit wonky, what I do is, much like I described with some other things, like say the fly, for example, I might do the first couple sets or the first half of a set where I'm biasing more of a short position. And then it allows me to get a little bit of pre fatigue and then do the lengthen afterwards. So in this case, with this like shoulder abducted position, tricep extension, I'm first of all using restraint for the shoulder where I have this like man, I think you've used like daisy chains. In this case, I'm using like an ab strap that you would do like hanging leg raises from. But just anything that I can push my arm into, there's no way I'm going to be able to describe just how this prime functional trainer is set up. But I literally have like a wedge that I can push into behind me. So I can lean my body forward into this strap that I'm pushing my arm into, and then I have a wrist cuff on that's connected to the cable, and thus, taking sort of that both the limitation of the grip and also some of what we talked about earlier in terms of moving um, that that position of loading higher and what that can potentially do from like an orthopedic perspective. So I start off basically facing the arm of the machine, which makes it relatively heavier in the short position. I'll go to failure there, and then I'll face literally like without taking anything off. I'll just face away from the arm of the machine, and it's basically the cable's coming over my opposite shoulder, and now I'm up here. So if I was upside down, it would almost look like a skull crusher, but because just with one arm, skull crusher where my arm was more perpendicular to the floor, but you can never have a dumbbell that was loading you across your body like that. So in this case, the cable is coming from across my body, and so I've done my short position. I turn into it. And at this point, because I didn't need to use a ton of weight for the short position, with the lengthened position, I'm able to use my other hand and kind of assist the profile a little bit as well. And then, the shorter position, meaning shorter at the shoulder. So now arm at my side, tricep exercise, basically the same exact setup, but just with my arm at my side. And since I've already done that short position stuff, I'm already in a position where I don't need a ton of load. I've already kind of pre-fatigued with that shoulder abducted position tricep exercise, and I can go right into this one from a lengthened position.
Yeah, and I think that a good maybe takeaway from that is not necessarily that people have to use that kind of complicated setup, but more so just that the point of doing it for you in particular is so that you can manage it orthopedically and so that you can also sustain some degree of variability across that one session. So I think a good takeaway from that is just when you're training triceps, in all likelihood, you probably don't need to differentiate hugely between the short and the long. Like as you are, you can probably pick something in the middle, and that will be fairly good for most people. And then just do it in multiple shoulder positions. So do it with your arm out to your side, do it with your arm, next to you, do it with your arm overhead, do it with your arm across your body. All those things with cables, I think, are solid options for people to use across, one or multiple days of tricep stuff.
Yeah, and then it's like, ideally have something kind of holding up your arm or something to shove, your arm into as a restraint, and that tends to help us a lot as well. And sometimes it's just your body weight, for
Yep.
the arm side variation. With the wedge behind me, I'm really able to lean forward and kind of leverage my body weight against the resistance pulling me upwards.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's triceps. And then middle delts, I've been doing that bilateral to start with more of like a Y raise variation, and I'm doing it on the cable. So what I do is I roll a bench up to the cables. I set it on very like low incline, and again I'm using the wrist cuffs here, and I lay backwards and I do the Y raise, on the bench. So the slight incline for me is mostly just makes it easier to get up from than just like if I was, completely flat position. And also I just don't run into tissue with the cable. So it's a spot where the cable doesn't hit me and it's easy to get up from. The cable kind of helps, pull me up from that position too. Um, I found with this variation, one, again, it's bilateral, so I'm not being twisted. Two, the profile's really good in terms of when my arms start to go behind me. The It's really getting lighter as I move into the short position, and it does feel like an exercise again where I can make really subtle tweaks as I move through the range. So I have the wrist cuff on. I can really uh, change very slightly where I'm applying pressure, through that cuff. The profile is really great in terms of how much it's dropping off. So the final reps are extremely slow, and it just allows me to really take inventory as I move through it, like what I'm feeling and what position I'm staying in throughout.
Yeah, and just for a visual on this, You can do Y raises when you're standing. You can do them single arm. You can do them laying down like you're describing. You can also do them with a chest support. I think, restraints in this case are probably not as, I don't want to say they're not as important, but just because of the nature of like middle delt stuff, they're generally easy to stabilize, especially if you're doing them bilaterally. But as you start to use more and more and more load, and as you start to move, the point of application maybe closer to your shoulder and absolute load goes up, it can be helpful to either, lie down on something, have your body weight supporting you, or have, something like a chest support, which can kind of be sometimes awkward to set up, but I think equally as useful. Um, cool. So then was that it? Or I felt like you had one more.
Yeah, the other
Um,
middle belt, instead of like, my arms moving behind me, is, an arms moving, in sort of a 45-degree or kind of scapular plane in front of me. So that's just standing up, facing away from the cables. For most people, the cables are crossing behind them or crossing in front of them, with the Y raise and the lateral raise respectively. For me, in order to get them crossing, I don't actually need to cross the cable, or in order to get them diverging, I don't need to actually cross the cables. I just set them up. I set the arms of the machine relatively narrow, and that allows the cables to just diverge around me without actually having to cross them behind my back. So there's probably limited application again for if you're particularly wide. Most people will have the cables crossing behind them. But yeah, so I'm basically standing right over the top of these cables facing away. And then I also put like a wedge in front of me, like a 15-degree wedge in front of me. And when I start to get close to failure, I basically just, push into that and allow myself to kind of lean back a little bit. And that assists with that drop off of the cable, getting lighter at the top.
mm. Yeah, you love that light drop off.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get nice and riled up for the light drop off.
But yeah, that's the last of the middle delts for the most part. I mean, you've seen me also get on the Kaiser machine and do some overloaded eccentrics there as well.
Yeah, yeah, like the same strategy as with the seated calf that you were talking about.
Yeah, exactly. It literally was a 5-minute set where I'm just like uh, resisting the most weight I possibly can, through that eccentric part, and then lightening it, doing the maximum amount I can on the concentric, making it heavy again, resisting the eccentric. So there's some wacky stuff that gets in there, but other than that, I do some forearm stuff, supination, pronation, ulnar deviation, radial deviation, like with the club bell. I use some kind of pad. In this case, I use the hyperextension pad. Um, Club bell's nice again as far as the profile, because we can, depending on how far away from the sort of center of mass you grab with the club bell, you can make it heavier and heavier in the lengthened position relative to the short. And yeah, I go through one set of each of those positions with the club bell. Do the tibialis as well. I've been doing that single leg, uh, something to shove my leg up into, which happens to be a seatbelt here. And then I use my other foot again to assist the profile short. So I do one set of the tibialis on both sides, one set of the forearms, and I've also considered throwing some back extension work in there and some potential work for abdominals as well. But what I'm looking to do this season is just see, like, is that something that just gets covered, automatically by everything else, or would throwing some isolation work in there for the trunk actually, present a different look on stage? So
Mm.
not something like I've totally settled on at this point, but at least for this year, I'll abstain from isolated, trunk exercises.
All right, cool. Yeah, I think that was very thorough, a good thorough 2 episodes, and I think it'll be interesting to see how, 6 months from now or whatever amount of time it'll be pre-contest, those things have changed or shifted around, and then what the reasons for those changes and shifts happen to be if they do occur. So we can do some updated stuff, maybe a couple months from now on these same things. Cool. Cool.